All right, welcome back for the extra challenges section. So I'm actually going to spend most of this one just talking about kind of the a reminder of everything that was happening in the initial part of the lesson, just because it gets more complicated as you're adding things. And so if anything, doing these challenges is just continued practice in remembering all of the different parts of a select element and then coming up with something fun to do with it. So my example in both of these cases, because the first one, the second one builds on the first one and just adds to it, is Harry Potter characters. It's one of my favorite sets of books, and the movies are fine. So I created a new JavaScript function entirely that's going to change the text, similar to how we do in our welcome function, but it's going to change the text in a totally new div, or totally new paragraph. Apologize. Change that on the fly right here. You'll see I have that down here with a different ID. So the one for the welcome function is called welcome. This one is called quote, which happens to tie to the JavaScript function name. Not necessary that it does that, but I find it easier. So you will also then have a second form in your HTML. So you would have, wherever you have all of the other stuff going, you're going to have a whole separate section for this, which I will show you will make more sense in the example. It's going to have another select element inside. It's going to have another button inside. I would recommend making the text of the button be something different than submit, unless you have the whole thing kind of laid out with enough space in between. Otherwise, it might be confusing for someone who's trying to submit your previous set of questions where they should actually submit things. And your other button, the on click, will call your new JavaScript function name for the new function you will create. So for my select element, I gave it the ID character, and then I have my blank option, which is just what displays by default, or if I ever want to clear the selection, because this doesn't have a value, this is what the one I would encourage someone to pick to clear it. Then I chose 4 character options to include. I have a button. I chose Lumos as my click, or as my button text. And then my on click is the quote function that I've created down in JavaScript. The starting text that I used for the paragraph tag was "Give me Hogwarts wisdom, please," because all of these are quotes from the book that are in some way or another slightly wisdom based, roughly. So I can close my, I will just leave it there, I guess. In here, this part will look familiar at least. I cut down the number of questions I had up here just because in the example here, this was so long that it was really hard to get to this bottom part where I have things. So I just cut out a couple of those. They still work, and this still works, and you can still pick a background color. In fact, in this case, actually call attention real quick to the fact that I decided that I also wanted to simplify my my function down here, my welcome function. You'll see I still have the name and I still have the animal, and then I still build this nice building block string of a welcome and adding in the variable names plus plus plus. But then for the selection of a background color, I don't have that big series of if statements, partially because I wanted this all to be easier to read, and partially because I wanted to show another option. Instead of choosing multiple background colors across the color spectrum and changing the text of everything based on which one they choose, I just added more background colors that all are guaranteed to work with the colors I chose. So I picked a light pink and a light green and white or light blue. So these are all ones that would work with the black text I chose. So I don't have to do a bunch of conditional checks to determine if I've picked one that needs a light or a dark text. They're all going to work with dark, and people still get a nice choice about which of these is their favorite. So it's another option if you, in this circumstance or in any other circumstance, you can always make it a little easier on yourself by just saying, I'm going to give you these choices. Here they are. And for the most part, people will be able to pick one among them. So that's why I kept this up here, was for that example. And just for the sake of making sure we have some answers in here, perfect. So let's say all of that is good to go. So now we're moving on to a game of choices with characters from one of these movies. I have 4 choices down in here, which is what we saw in here, that I had each of those. If you recall from the way we did the colors, you have 2 things. You have what JavaScript sees and what the user sees. So down here, I was even easier, and I made it exactly the same. However, you would be able to, for example, decide that for the user, they might not be as familiar. And so you want to put full names in for those. You don't need to do that to JavaScript because JavaScript isn't going to know who Hermione is, whether you have her last name or not. So all you're saying is, if they pick this one, I want you to be aware that this is how they're answering. So we have those. We have our new button set on this. And then down here in the JavaScript section, for our quote function, this should look familiar. You have a character, and you're going to go up and you're going to look for the element with the ID character, taking that value and you're sticking it into a variable called character. Then you're doing this whole set of checks. If the character they chose was equal to Hermione, you're going to do this. If it's Dumbledore, if it's Hagrid, if it's Snape. And then we have this catch-all, which we didn't use in the color one because it really doesn't make any sense, but it does here, which is if they didn't choose any of them, in this case, that means they chose this because it's the only one that isn't any of those. And so in that case, what I set back to as the quote is the starting quote that I have sitting here. So what happens when they pick each of these? Well, I went out and I picked a funny or a favorite or a goofy or anything, a well-known quote from each of the characters from the books. And this part is exactly the same thing as we did in the welcome tag, the welcome paragraph tag. We went, we got the element that had that ID. So this one is there. And then we changed the inner HTML, which you'll remember started as give me Hogwarts Post and Please, with a quote. And this one, we have another quote, this choice, another quote, this choice, another quote. And then for the else, the catch-all, it goes back to this. So no matter who they chose, this is going to change to match the quote that I picked. Now, you could do this with anything. You could have a list of animals, and it could be select an animal to get a fact about that animal. And you go out and you look for facts, one for every animal. And then as you're doing this, it would be if animal equals cat, change all this and put in your fact right here as a line that could be they can always land on their feet. I'm pretty sure that's true, but it's also one of those things that could be very well not true, and I've just memorized that it is. So if anyone wants to explore that for their project, feel free. So you could do basically anything that you wanted. You can do characters, you could do books, you could do all kinds of different things. Interesting facts about locations, interesting facts about numbers, pretty much anything. Colors, anything like that. The sky is the limit, literally. But the important thing is the idea of giving someone all of these choices and then doing something based on those. And I felt like it was helpful to separate this whole section out from this whole section so that we do get the practice of having 2 different functions that are operating via 2 different buttons and 2 different forms entirely, so that you keep everything kind of separated. Because if I decided that I just wanted to get rid of everything that was up here, I don't need to have anyone introduce themselves anymore. I would just get rid of the welcome me function, and I would get rid of the whole form up here where that is covered. So everything that's like that would get rid of here through here. The welcome me function going away would mean it wasn't taking up space. And then I would start with right here and wouldn't have had to pull out bits of this from this form or anything like that. So I find that to be valuable. So that is challenge number 1. It's basically coming up with some other more interesting thing than a background color that you could get someone to choose an option and change some text as a result. The second challenge uses almost all the same HTML. So everything that's in black is stuff that we just used in that challenge. You don't have to change that. The only new thing is that we add an image. We give it an ID because, again, if it's JavaScript, we need an ID because we're going to have to find it somehow. And then in this case, I selected the starting source to be this picture of the whole cast. So great, we have that. And if you can see in here, what you saw in this part here. Okay, so that was our starting picture. Down here, I have my paragraph tag that is the starting quote. And then I have the image tag that is my starting image. Good, ready to go. So now most of this, again, stays black. Most of this is exactly the same stuff as we used before. We have the same function. We have the same variable assignment based on the value of what is in the element with the ID character. And then we check each one of the characters. Hermione, yes or no. Dumbledore, yes or no. Hagrid, yes or no. Snape, yes or no. Else, fallback. Each of the quotes stay the same. The only difference now is that we have a second thing that has to happen inside of each set of curly braces. So if whichever one of these we actually meet and we head inside of to get our snack from the fridge, we have a second thing now that we have to do, which is setting the source of that picture and changing it to something else. So in here, I literally just have copy your image address here. And then in this one, the image address that it sets is exactly the same as the starting one here, static 3 dot, static 3 dot. In my example, you can see if I open up JavaScript, you can see that I actually have, so for Hermione, I have a picture source here. And then for Dumbledore, I have a different one, for Hagrid, and for Snape. So each of them I went out and got. I didn't put these in here, because they take up a lot of space to type out, and then it pushes it onto a very unpleasant page setup. And also because honestly, these images change a lot. So frequently I will go through and try to do an example, and then the image won't work because they took it down or someone moved it. And that's frustrating to put in here because we encourage everyone to go back and continue referencing. So I would feel terrible if someone tried to type something that didn't exist and it wasn't their fault at all. It was just that the image went somewhere else. So we have all of this. So we're going to do both quotes and pictures for each one. And the way that would look in here is great. We have Hermione, we change the quote, and we change that photo to the one that we have right here. We move to Dumbledore, and we change the quote, and we change the photo. This picture cracks me up. Hilarious. And we do the same here, also pretty funny. And then lastly, here. So in each of these cases, this is working exactly the same as the first challenge. The only difference is we're doing a second step based on whichever one has come through. So if you, when you're creating your own select element and you're creating especially all your own choices, the most important things you need to keep in mind are that the green thing, the green text inside of the value here is what needs to match up here. So if you changed this by mistake, and this is what you put down and didn't change that down here, it doesn't matter how many times they select this, it's never going to get to this because as far as JavaScript is concerned, this is not what was chosen. It's going to go down and it's going to do what's in the else because it's going to say, hey, I don't have anything that matches exactly that. So it's very important to make sure as you're taking all of this and you're starting with something super creative and different. It's especially important in the challenges because you're probably overhauling all of this. If you don't change these two things in lockstep, and then this one you want to change to the user doesn't, choose Dumbledore, but you've changed this to be soccer or something, that would be very confusing for them. You just want to make sure that all those stay in line so that it's accurately handling the choices you have provided the user. Because now we've done this so that people can't make dumb decisions for themselves and say their favorite color is black on a page full of navy blue text. But if we're giving them all these choices, we want to make sure all the choices are actually recognized down in our JavaScript. And that's it. That's the end of the challenges. So this is, there's a lot of possibilities here and a lot of fun things that you can do, but it definitely does require a lot of attention to detail back and forth. And it is very easy for things to not work with something very, very small. So if you run into any questions or problems, as always, send us an email and let us know, and we will help as best we can before we start our virtual sessions on the 19th in a few weeks. All right, I'll talk to everyone later. Bye.